Bin Chase. I've been sitting at this bar for about 3 hours now, and I still have no idea of what I am going to do. I had hoped that a couple of stiff drinks would give me some wisdom, but all it had done was give me a headache, and when I closed my eyes, I could still see the scene that sent me running from the house. Her on her knees with him from behind. I ran from the house, got into my car, and drove like a madman for 2 days, stopping and sleeping in my car when I was tired, eating crap from the convenience stores where I stopped for gas, then driving some more until I finally ran out of steam, slowing when I came to this place, wherever in the hell it was. It was early in the morning, but I needed a place to crash, so I just drove through town until I saw this bar with its flashing neon lights telling me it was a traveler's oasis. I decided that if I could get seriously drunk, the pain would go away, but I was a shitty drinker. Always had been. I think that was my grandmother's fault. She used to take a switch to me when she caught me drinking beer with the other kids. But heck, that was almost 20 years ago. I was deliberating on the most serious subject I could handle, whether to order another shot with a chaser or find a quiet room where I could end it all, when an older gentleman slipped onto the stool next to me and quietly asked if he could buy me a drink. Well, the first thing I did was give him the eagle eye to be sure he knew I wasn't one of those fancy boys. He saw the look and just smiled, told me not to worry. Bill Austin. As was usual for me, I had my first beer at just past 10 o'clock in the morning. I had been keeping to this routine 3 times a week for the past year, ever since Mary, my wife, died. I don't know why I come here. I never get drunk. Matter of fact, I've never been drunk in my life. I just like it here, and I can watch some of the most interesting people this way. I don't have to be responsible for them now, so I can just watch and imagine their problems and their lives without having to think of how to help them. For example, there was only one other person in here this time of morning, and he was sitting at the bar drinking straight whiskey with beer chasers, a sure sign of a man with a big-time problem. I had been watching him since he came in. He truly looked lost and in some kind of pain. Probably a woman, most likely. That was the most common affliction that hit men of his age. But for some reason, this particular man touched something in me, and I felt the vague stirring of interest. That in itself was unusual, since I had stopped giving a damn about much of anything since Mary went away. On a whim, I moved to the stool next to him and offered to buy him a drink. I wanted to hear his voice and maybe get him talking. I guess I was staring, since the man noticed my gaze and took it wrong. It appeared he thought I was gay. Damn, that was a real hoot. I thought I had better set him straight. Rest easy, boy. I've been sitting right over there in that booth and noticed you seem to be a man with a big problem. I've got nothing but time on my hands now that I'm retired and widowed. Just wanted to buy you a drink and ask if you wanted a friendly ear. Ben Chase. I gave him the once over and relaxed. He seemed to be just what he said he was. At least, I was willing to take a free drink and trust that he was old enough that I could flatten him if he made a pass. And anyway, I did want to talk. Wouldn't mind a drink and a friendly ear. Sure, you want to hear my sad tale of woe? I've got nothing better to do, and I hate drinking alone. Let's go to my booth where it's quieter. I hate to shout. Well, since we were the only 2 people in the bar at that particular time, I didn't plan on doing much shouting, since it was so quiet you could hear the clock behind the bar ticking. But what the hell? I'd humor the old shit. We went back to his booth, and I sat across from him with a double shot and a bud chaser. I put both in front of me and looked at the old dude. My name's Ben Chase. I'm from Chester, Pennsylvania, a couple of days from here. And by the way, where in hell am I? He just laughed and told me, well, Ben, you happen to find yourself in a nice place called Dayton, Indiana. Seems like you just followed I-70 West and it brought you right here. Glad to meet you, Ben. I'm Bill Austin, and I live just a block from here. Lived here all my life. My wife Alice died about a year ago and left me with a broken heart and a lot of wonderful memories. But enough about me. What's your story? Fair enough. I wanted to talk, and Bill seemed to be more than willing to let me tell him chapter and verse if I so wanted. Well, I did. I had to tell someone. First, Bill, I have to give you some background on why I'm here. If I just told you I found out that my wife cheated on me, that wouldn't be such a big deal, and you'd think I was some kind of wimp, running away like I did, but there's more to it than that. I'll just start, and you just sort of jump in if I say something you don't understand. Okay. Sounds good to me. You just tell it in your own way, and with your own words. I'll just try to let you tell it without interrupting. So, I took the double and downed it in one quick gulp and followed it with a swallow of bud and began my story. I was raised in a loving home by my father and mother. We lived in Weirton, West Virginia, and my daddy, Howard Chase, worked in the steel mill there. He worked in the rolling mill, and he was on shift work as a shift supervisor. Made good money for the time, and was always dependable and did a job for his pay. He had learned self-discipline in the county system, growing up as an orphan. He didn't know how he got there, and no one seemed to have any information for him about his natural parents. But since he went into the system late, being almost 7 at the time, he was never adopted. He stayed in the system till he was 18, and then they let him out with $20 and a cardboard suitcase with everything he owned. He found a job in the steel mills around there, and he worked as many shifts as he could. Once he had been there for 90 days, he joined the union and became a full-fledged mill worker. He made good money for the times and got himself a car and found an apartment that he could rent. He continued to work and bid on all the jobs that were a higher level than he had at the time. Shift work didn't bother him, so he often got a good job because no one else with more seniority wanted it on the off shifts. Things seemed to be good. My daddy met my mother, Pauline, on the job, and they dated for 2 years before he finally proposed to her. They were married, and Daddy used some of his savings to buy them a small 2-bedroom home away from the smoke of the mill and sort of out of ways. Mom loved the place and always seemed to be content with what they had. I remember her telling me as I was growing up that it was a home that I could be proud of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Mom and Dad waited for a couple of years before having me. I was born 3 years after they were married, and Mom was able to take off work when she was about 6 months along. She spent the time getting the second bedroom cleared out and fixed up for my arrival. She was happy, and so was Daddy. At least that's what Grandma told me later. I just remember the ceiling of that room when I was old enough to see things. It was sky blue with little wild clouds painted on. There was a light covered by a globe that made it look like the sun. I remember that ceiling all the time. I loved that ceiling. It made me feel safe and secure. Still does when I think about it. Anyway, I was raised in that house. Mom stayed home with me for the first 5 years of my life. I remember her fairly well. She had pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. She was small. I remember that. She carried me on her hip most of the time, and she was always taking me places. The grocery store, shopping, church, and sometimes to the park where they had swings and seesaws and sandboxes. I loved the sliding board when she would wait at the bottom for me to slide down to her waiting arms. When I started school, Mom decided to go back to work. I think Daddy asked her to stay home, but she wanted to get out of the house and do something. She finally took a part-time job in a doctor's office nearby. She walked to work, so it had to be close. But even with her working, she was home every day when I got out of school, and she was always part of our dinner in the evenings. We made it a point to get together at dinner, one of her rules. Even as I grew older and became involved in sports, activities with other kids, and things that all kids do, I knew that I had to be home for dinner. When I was 8, I came home for dinner one evening and found Mom and Dad just sitting at the kitchen table. I looked around but didn't see dinner ready. When I asked Mom what was wrong, she just looked at me with tears in her eyes and told me that she hadn't been able to fix dinner that night. She got up and fixed Dad and me something to eat, but she didn't sit down with us. Instead, she went off to bed and didn't come back that evening. When I asked Dad what was wrong, he wouldn't tell me anything. He just said that it was grown-up things, but I remember he was crying too. Say, could we get some coffee over here? Telling this story is hard enough. I don't need to be drunk to tell it any better. Go ahead with your story. I'll get the waiter over here with some of that swill they call coffee. Go ahead. This is a damn good story. All that week, things were different around the house. Mom and Dad hardly spoke to each other, and our dinners were quiet and strained affairs. I remember now that it was clear that Dad was angry at Mom, and Mom was trying very hard to talk to Dad, but he refused to answer her most of the time. I hated it, but I was too young to understand what was happening. I never did know until much later when Grandma Pearl told me. All I knew at the time was that Mom was always crying and Dad was working more and more at the mill. After a few weeks, Dad stopped coming home for dinner, and it was just Mom and me. She was so quiet that I was afraid she was getting sick, but when I asked her, she just said that she was sad. She tried to be strong, but she wasn't able to fool me. Nothing much changed for us for the next few weeks, but I saw my dad get more and more quiet and Mom got more and more sad. I didn't understand, but I knew it was bad. I knew something was seriously wrong when Dad began sleeping in the little room we had just off the entryway. It wasn't much bigger than a closet, but Mom always referred to it as our parlor. We never used it, and Dad always intended to open it up and make the living room bigger. Now, he set up a cot in there and began sleeping there. I came home from school one afternoon to find cars and people everywhere and some policemen in the house. I ran inside to see what was wrong, but Grandma was there, and she grabbed me as I tried to get past her to find my mom. She held me tight and wouldn't let me go. I started to cry and twist to get loose, but she finally made me stop and face her. I stopped struggling and asked her what was wrong. "Grandma, what's wrong? Where's Mommy and Daddy? Is something wrong with Mommy?" "No, boy. Your mother's fine. It's your daddy. He's had a terrible accident. He's gone, boy. He's gone and he's not coming back." No, that's not true. My dad wouldn't go away without me. It's not true." Grandma held me tight against her bosom and rocked me over and over till I calmed down. She finally let me loose and took me in to see my mother. She was sitting in the living room, her arms clamped around her knees and her head down so that I could only see the top of her head. She was very still and just swaying forward and back, forward and back. I ran to her and tried to put my arms around her, but she hardly recognized me. I called her, but she didn't answer. The policemen were walking through the house and poking into everything, but Mom didn't say anything to stop them. I was getting scared, but Grandma came and got me and pulled me away. She took me back to the kitchen and made me sit down. I wanted to get up and run to the parlor where Dad was sleeping, but the police had the hallway blocked, and anyway, Grandma wouldn't let me go. It must have been hours that the police were there, and Mom was in the living room talking to them. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't care. All I wanted was for them to leave our house and have her tell me about Dad. What happened, and why did he have to go away? What kind of accident did he have? What happened? I was panicked and afraid, and my heart was broken. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't, since I didn't know what I was crying for. It was 3 days later when Mom came to Grandma's house to pick me up. I had gone home with Grandma that day, and she kept me with her. I didn't even go to school for those 3 days, and I knew then that something serious had happened. I never got to stay home from school, but when Mom came to the house, she seemed to be better, and she even smiled at me when I ran to her. She held me in her arms and pressed her cheek against my hair and just held me. I clung to her as well. She took me in to see Grandma and told her that it was time I came home. Grandma just shook her head in agreement, and we went back to our house. The first thing I noticed was that Dad wasn't there. His jacket was not on the hook and his lunchbox was gone. His work shoes were not in the entranceway where he kept them, and there was no change of clothes on the hook for when he came home. I walked down to the parlor and looked for his cot and stuff, but nothing was there. I knew then that Dad was gone. I asked Mom about it, but all she said was that Dad had gone to a better place and that I should keep him in my prayers. She wouldn't say more then, but it was clear after that Dad was gone for good. Remember, I was 8 at the time, and I had no idea of what happened, but I found out less than a year later when one of my friends at school spilled the beans. He told me that my dad had killed himself one night at home. He said that Dad had taken his shotgun and blown his head clean off right in the bathroom of our house. He said that my mother had found him and called the police. That was the day I came home from school to find all the cops there. That's what happened then. When I asked my mom that night, she didn't say anything for a while, but finally took both my hands in hers and told me the truth. It was true that Dad had killed himself. She told me as little about it as possible, but she said that it was true and that she had come home to find him there. She was sorry that it took her so long to tell me, but she wanted to be sure she had the right words for me. She wanted me to know that he was a very good man, but that things had become too much for him to handle, and he thought that this was the only way he could deal with it. I told her that the minister at church always told us it was a sin to kill yourself, but Mom got angry and said that Dad would be forgiven. He was a good man, and he took what he thought was the only way for him. From that day on, Mom was always at home with me. She didn't go back to work, and she stayed in the house almost all the time. I never saw her go out except to get groceries or to take me to places I needed to go. She quit the church and her job, and she never invited people over to the house anymore. She was quiet and withdrawn, but she was never cross with me. She made sure that I did my schoolwork and that I was always prepared for my tests and such. But I noticed that she was becoming more and more sad as the days went by. It had been almost a year since Dad died when she told me she wanted me to stay with Grandma for a while. She said that she had something to take care of and that I would be okay with her. I didn't want to go, but I finally had no choice. Grandma picked me up on a Friday night, and I stayed with her that weekend. Monday, I expected Mom to pick me up for school, but she never came. When I asked Grandma, she said she would take me home instead, and we would see what Mom was up to. We finished breakfast, and I helped her clean the table so that we could go. We drove home, and Grandma pulled into the drive. I jumped out before she could get the car stopped and ran into the house. I smelled something funny as soon as I opened the door, but I didn't recognize the smell. I called for Mom, but I got no answer. I ran down the hall to her room and looked in. She was on the bed, I thought asleep, but when I tried to wake her, she didn't stir. I reached over to grab her arm and jerked my hand back when I felt how cold she was. I moved closer to her face and saw immediately that it was very pale and cold. I looked down at my hand and saw the smear of red. Suddenly I knew. She was dead. I then saw the blood on the floor and on the bed. I remember screaming for Grandma, and then nothing else. It was almost a week before I was well enough to go home with Grandma. The doctor said that I suffered a traumatic episode, whatever that was. I was a kid and I found my mother dead. What the hell do you call that, and why was everyone surprised that I zoned out for a while? Well, I did. But afterwards, I went home with Grandma and thought about my parents as little as I could until I had pretty much put them in the back of my mind. I was on my own. They both left me and didn't care about me. They just went away. Anyway, Grandma was a real pusher, and she made sure I had little free time to brood or mope around. She raised me from then on, and I pretty much turned out okay. On my 18th birthday, Grandma bought me an old car that she told me I could fix up and drive around. We didn't have much between us, but this was much more than I had hoped for. I told her it was the best present in the whole world, and to me, it really was. She let me fuss with it until late that night before calling me in. After I washed up and came down to watch TV until bedtime, Grandma told me she had something else for me. I perked up right away, expecting another gift, but instead she handed me a letter. "That's a letter from your mother, boy. She left it when she did away with herself. It's addressed to you. Said to give it to you on your 18th birthday. That's today. I wasn't sure whether to give it to you or not, but it was her wish, so I'm giving it to you." I remember thinking that I didn't want this stupid letter. I had my new car and my grandma had given it to me. Mom didn't. Mom wasn't even there, so why would I care? It made me a little mad. "You've had this all these years? Why'd you wait? She's dead 'cause she didn't care enough about me to stay and try to raise me. She left that to you, so why the hell did you care what she wanted? Have respect for your dead mother, boy. She was my daughter and I knew her best. You don't know nothing. She and your dad did what they did for their own reasons. It's not up to you or me to judge them. God will do that. Now, do you want this letter or not? It's up to you." Well, of course I took it. It was from her, and I wanted to know what she had to tell me. She couldn't tell me then, so I guess she figured time would make it easier on me? I didn't know. Anyway, I took it and put it in my room in a drawer under my socks. I didn't open it right away. It took me the better part of a week before I got up the nerve. Grandma never asked me about it, and I didn't mention it again. Well, anyway, I finally opened it and read it. But rather than telling you what it said, I'll let you read it for yourself. With that, I got out my folded copy of the letter and smoothed it out onto the tabletop. I was careful not to tear it as it was pretty dog-eared and wrinkled, but it was readable. I stared at it for a minute before I pushed it over to Mr. Austin to read for himself. This is what it said. "My dearest Ben, if your grandma did as I asked, when you read this, you will be a man grown. I know you believe I left you alone and that I didn't care about you. I swear to you that's not true, and I can only hope that you will understand after reading what I have to tell you. You were too young to understand at the time. I loved your father with all my heart, but I did something that hurt him very much. You know that I worked at a doctor's office where I met many people. There was one sweet gentleman that was very sick, and the doctor told him he had only a short time to live. I became friends with him when he came to see the doctor, and we talked about our lives and our families while he waited. I told him about my wonderful family, about you and your father, but he had no one. His wife had died. He had no children, and he was alone. I felt sorry for him. One day he asked me to have lunch with him, and I agreed. thinking that as a friend it would be all right. We went to lunch, but things became complicated, and I ended up going to his home and sleeping with him. That was a terrible thing to do, but at the time, I was only thinking of it as a way to make his last days more pleasant. He was in such pain. Your father and I loved each other, and I thought that what I had done would not affect my life with him. The man was grateful, but wanted to continue to see me. At first I refused, thinking of the guilt I felt having been unfaithful to your father. But eventually, seeing the pain he was in and the small pleasure I gave him, I agreed, and we continued to see and sleep with each other. I swear to you that I was only trying to make his last days more bearable and more pleasant. I had no feelings for him other than friendship. I never saw what I was doing as being unfaithful to your father, but I felt so bad about what I had done that I finally told your father the truth. That was the day our lives changed forever. I pleaded with Howard to forgive me and tried to explain why I had done this thing, but he wouldn't listen. We fought, and he became distant and pushed me away. I knew that trust was something very important to your father, but I never saw what I did as being a matter of trust. That's why I finally told him. I couldn't live with keeping secrets from him. Your father, however, saw it as much more. I was devastated, but I never truly understood the depth of his pain. I had hurt him terribly, but I didn't see it at the time. I was too concerned with my own guilt and my fear of losing him and my wonderful family. I worried only about myself. I let him down in so many ways. But we were still together, and he never asked me to leave, so I hoped that things would get better if I just waited and dedicated myself to making him happy. The day that I went to find the latest on my friend was the day your father shot himself. I found out later that he knew where I was going, even though I never told him. I was only trying to find out if my friend was still alive, but your father didn't understand. He saw that as the final betrayal, and he took his own life. He left a note to me, but I destroyed it before the police came. It was so cruel and accusing, and I deserved everything he said, but I couldn't stand to see those hateful words, so I destroyed it. He died never having forgiven me. I tried to live with the guilt of what I did to him and what it forced him to do, but I couldn't go on any longer. The pain that he felt was now mine, and I can't live with the burden of it. Just as with your father, it continues to grow inside me until I fear it will devour me. I have tried to live in spite of the pain and be a good mother for you, but the pain won't let me alone. It has grown on its own until it is all I can feel. I plan to take my own life now. I hope and pray that God will forgive me and that I will be given the opportunity in that next life to apologize to Howard. I am sorry not to see you grow and prosper, but I know that I can't be a good mother to you any longer. The pain is too intense, and I fear it will destroy you as well if I continue to live with it. Your grandmother will provide for you and give you a good home. This is all I have left to give you. Please try to forgive me. Your loving mother, Pauline. Bill finished the letter with a tear in his eye. I knew the feeling. I had cried many times when I read that letter. I don't know to this day whether I forgave her, but I didn't hate her any longer. Actually, I didn't hate either of them. They deserted me because of their own pain, forgetting the pain that I would be left with. But they were my parents, and I loved them in spite of their failings. But on with the story. Well, after I read the letter, I finally understood what had happened to my mother and father. It was tragic, but it at least made sense to me now. At the time, Mom was right. I wouldn't have understood. Now as I read the letter again, I understood why they had done what they did, but I still couldn't forgive them for leaving me behind. Those feelings might fade, but not yet. But now, I was 18 and on my own, and I used the trust fund Mom and Dad had set up for me years ago to go to college. I finally graduated with a degree in chemical engineering, and I went to work for a big oil company and got to see a whole lot of the world. It was a great experience, but I wanted to settle down in the States and make my way in this big world. You know, Bill, I want to tell you the rest of this story, but right now, I feel like hell and I need to lie down and sleep. I am really beat and I haven't eaten or slept now for 2 days, and I need to just crash. I'll go out in the car and try to sleep for a few hours, and then if you're still here, I'll finish. That work for you? Sure, but I think you need to come home with me and sleep in a bed instead of your car. I have a spare bedroom and no one's used it for years. My kids don't visit much anymore since my wife died, so it's just me. Come on now. Let's get some food in you and then some sleep. With that, Bill helped me up and we walked out of the bar and down the quiet street toward his house. I don't remember much about the trip except that it didn't take much time, and before I knew it I was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a sandwich of ham and cheese. I did put the sandwich away, and the coffee too, but I was almost out on my feet, so Bill helped me down to a neat little room with a double bed and a calico cover. It looked like heaven to me, so I flopped down on it and was asleep before I stopped bouncing. I never felt Bill slip off my shoes and jacket. I was dead to the world. Bill Austin. After eating the sandwich I prepared for him, Ben was almost dead on his feet. He was wobbling in his chair, so I pulled him up. I just barely got him to bed before he passed out. He was truly dead to the world. I looked at him sleeping there and realized that this man was really hurting. He had told me part of his story, and I believed that I knew what was coming. And if what I suspected was true, Ben was in for a rough time. I happened to know this because I had been a practicing psychologist for the past 30 years. I knew people, and I had a God-given gift of empathy, allowing me to help hundreds of them during my time. I hadn't practiced now for over 2 years, since Mary, my wife, got sick. I couldn't help others when I was hurting so badly myself. But Mary was dead, and I had little to interest me anymore. Ben interested me, however. He sounded like a decent man who had been hurt terribly and was struggling with the emotions that were tearing at him. His past was directing him towards seriously hurting himself or someone else, but his innate decency seemed to be pushing him the other direction. He was emotionally tearing himself apart. I slipped off his shoes and his jacket and pulled a blanket out of the closet. I was ready to put it over him and let him sleep when I made a decision. I reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. I quickly opened it to find one of those contact cards in case of emergency. It had his wife's name and phone number on it, and I copied it down on a note card. I replaced his wallet and covered him with the blanket. I left quietly and shut the blinds. It was just past dinner time here, and it was still light, but the blinds made it very dark, so he would probably sleep for several hours. I went down the hall to the little office I still kept in our small home and sat down at my desk. It had been several months since I last came in here. I switched on the library lamp that Mary gave me one Christmas. When its yellow light played on the desktop, the memories came flooding back and I hesitated for a moment, but decided to follow through on my original intent. I used the desk phone that I kept only for my practice, which had a blocked call number, so no one could use caller ID to get my number. Sometimes a psychiatrist can make some very strange people angry. I called the home number hoping for his wife and heard the phone ring just once when she answered. Ben? Ben, is that you? Ben, talk to me, please. Is this Mrs. Chase? Mrs. Annabeth Chase? Are you Ben Chase's wife? Yes, this is Beth Chase. Who are you, and is something wrong with Ben? Has Ben been hurt? Oh, please tell me he is okay. My name is Bill and Ben is fine. He's with me right now and he's sleeping. He's had a rough time of it, and he needs to sleep now and calm down. He's an emotional wreck. No, I have to talk to him. I need to talk to him right now. Please, put him on so that I can talk to him. I'm afraid I'm not going to do that. He shouldn't talk to you right now in the mood he's in. He's a very angry and disturbed man, and I believe you are the cause of that anger. It would not be good for you to talk to him just now. Oh God, what did he tell you? What did he say? Oh, I need to talk to him and explain to him what he saw. Please, whoever you are, let me talk to him. What do you know about his parents? What has he told you? This is very important, Mrs. Chase, so I need you to answer me honestly. I was very concerned about her answer. If she knew of his history and what his parents did and why they did it, then she was guilty of stupidity at the very least and absolute cruelty at the worst. I needed to understand her part in this first before going any further. I don't know what you're talking about. Ben's parents died when he was very young and his grandmother raised him. What does that have to do with anything? Did he tell you how they died? No, he just said they died accidentally and he didn't like talking about it. So I never pushed him. So now can I talk to him? Mrs. Chase, I am a professional psychiatrist and I'm going to talk to your husband some more and then I'll decide what to do about you. For now, you have no choice but to trust me. And I would be very sure you think carefully about what you have done to him and what you intend to say to him. He is in a very dangerous mood right now, and it is best if he not be anywhere close to you. It is also important that he be watched very carefully, especially now. I don't understand any of this. I insist that you let me talk to him right now. Goodbye, Mrs. Chase. Remember what I said? With that, I hung up before she could say any more. It seemed that she didn't know of his past, and therefore ignorance and infidelity was her only crime. At least to me. In Ben's eyes, she was just like his mother, and she had done to him what his mother did to his father. Ben was spinning into the same cycle his father had fallen into, and it was a very dangerous time for him. I went back into the kitchen, fixed myself some dinner, and began to work out a plan to deal with Mr. Ben Chase. While I didn't practice anymore, I was not going to let a man so obviously in pain walk away. Not while I had the knowledge and the willingness to help him. Mary would understand. Annabeth Chase. The phone call had been the final straw. I hung up the dead phone and fell to my knees there in the kitchen and sobbed. I felt like my whole world had come apart. I had been waiting for 2 days to hear from my Ben, and now he wouldn't talk to me. Or at least the man named Bill wouldn't let me talk to him. I had made a very bad mistake when I let George Jenkins seduce me at home with his slick talk and his smooth manner. It had been just the one time after he had been after me for all those weeks, but it was the one time that Ben came home when he should have been working. He saw me and George together and had run out the door before I could even say his name. That was 2 days ago, and now Ben was gone and I had no idea where he could be. The man I spoke to was very mean to me and told me in no uncertain terms that I was the cause of Ben's running away. While I knew that was probably true, he had no right to keep me from talking to him and trying to explain. He warned me that it could be dangerous for me to be around Ben. No, Ben would never hurt me. He loved me. I was positive of that, and he would forgive me if I could just talk to him. I picked myself off the floor and sat down at the kitchen table. I wiped my face where the tears had flowed and made myself settle down. Crying was getting me nowhere. I tried to think of what had gone wrong. I met George at the Manor House where I worked 3 days a week as a volunteer, helping to man the serving lines at lunch and dinner. He had shown up about 5 weeks ago and introduced himself to me as George Jenkins, a financial advisor for Walter Johnson Investments downtown. He told me that he wanted to give some of his time to helping others, just like me. He was very sincere, and I liked him immediately. I also admit that I found him to be handsome and very sexy. I was attracted to him right from the start, and I knew I had flirted with him outrageously. I was a married woman and had no right to be doing it, but I convinced myself that it was just harmless fun. George seemed to enjoy the game as well, and I began to anticipate the days I worked with him. My life at home was fine, but there were times when Ben spent entirely too much time on the job. Lately, he had been spending most of the week at the site of a new refinery his company was building, and Ben had the responsibility of overseeing the installation of the new cracking towers in the petroleum distillation section. This was his design, and he was not going to let some other yo-yo handle it for him. I understood that, but it left me alone an awful lot. That was no excuse, but it was certainly a contributing factor. Ben would understand that if I could only talk to him. I knew that he would, since he was one of the most understanding and kind men I had ever met. I had to depend on his kindness now and hope for his understanding. I thought back to the day I met Ben for the first time. I was working as a realtor for a commercial real estate agency in Mount Lebanon in western Pennsylvania when I received a call from him requesting an agent to show him a site that was zoned industrial. I knew the parcel and told him I would meet him there in half an hour. I thought no more about it until I met him at the site. My first impression of him was of a man about my age, but so handsome with curly black hair, a well-disciplined body and brown eyes that seemed to see right through me. He shook my hand with a firm grip and treated me as an equal right off the bat. I felt my face become flushed as I returned his handshake and looked into those eyes. He didn't seem to notice and simply walked away toward the site. I followed slowly, trying to recover my professionalism. I finally caught up to him, and the next 2 hours were spent in a very businesslike manner as we discussed the size and access to the site as well as the zoning requirements and the utility arrangements offered by the city. It was time well spent as he signed an intent to buy letter that afternoon. Since the parcel would sell for well over $4.5 million, I stood to make a very nice piece of change. When he called my office 2 weeks later, I answered his questions and made arrangements to have the necessary paperwork done by the following Monday. He was very pleased with everything, and just before concluding our business, he asked if I would have dinner with him when he came to sign the papers. Without thinking, I agreed. We spoke for a few more minutes, but I didn't remember any of the following conversation. My head was still buzzing over the dinner invitation. What had gotten into me? I hardly knew this man, and I was going to dinner with him Monday night. But, try as I might, I was more pleased than anything. That Monday was the beginning of my life as I now knew it. Ben had arrived at the office at 5 p.m. sharp, and we had gone to the conference room with the other parties, and the deal was concluded by 6:15. There were handshakes all around, and Ben seemed pleased that everything had gone so smoothly. He asked me if I needed to stay around the office or could we start our evening early. Since I was done for the day, I agreed that we could leave right away. Ben was pleased and told me that we could either go to his hotel and have a drink in the bar before dinner, or we could have an early dinner and then take in a movie or something. I chose the bar. I was still slightly giddy about the bonus I had received with the completion of the sale, and I let my inhibitions go and had a mixed drink. I chose a raspberry daiquiri, and I enjoyed it so much I had a second one. Ben stayed with beer, but he seemed to enjoy watching me as I sipped the potent drink. He was very eloquent, and his conversation had me fascinated, as he discussed his travels around the world to most of the oil-producing nations. He dazzled me with names and places and stories of some of his more bizarre experiences, and I listened intently through it all. We forgot dinner, and the drinks were really hitting me hard on an empty stomach. By 8:30, I was beginning to slur my words, so Ben decided that I needed to sober up. Rather than let me stay in the bar, he helped me up and we went up to his room where he called for a pot of coffee from room service. I collapsed gratefully onto the king-sized bed and let my eyes drift closed. Ben gently shook me awake to take some coffee. He made me drink some of the hot liquid and the caffeine began to take effect. I finally came fully awake with the second cup and I was feeling somewhat embarrassed by my actions. Ben, however, thought nothing of it and simply let me wake up completely as he talked. Now that I was fully sober and able to stand by myself, I suggested I leave and allow him to have the rest of his evening. Ben got up and came to me to put his arms around my waist. I am very happy to spend the rest of my evening with you right here. If you still want dinner, I can have it sent up from room service. Otherwise, I would just be happy to hold you like this. This is fine, just hold me. I'm suddenly not hungry anymore. I was sober enough to realize what was happening and I found myself wanting it too. I looked into those deep, dark eyes and let myself fall into them. I raised my arms and slipped them around his neck as I pressed my cheek to his shoulder. He tightened his grip and pulled me against him as he kissed my hair. I closed my eyes just to enjoy the feel of his tight body and smell the musky scent of him. As he moved his hands up my back and around to cup my chest, I sighed in pleasure. I moved back just enough to allow his hands free access to my chest and turned my face into his, searching for his lips. I found them and pressed mine to his. I wanted him, and I wanted to be wanted by him. It seemed to be all that I could think of. His mouth, his body, and his hands, roaming all over me. I wanted his touch everywhere, and I moaned my approval as his hands moved down. As my legs struggled to keep me upright, Ben bent down and picked me up like I weighed nothing. He looked into my eyes as he carried me to the bed and gently laid me down. He backed away and I watched as he unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it off. I couldn't take my eyes from him as he then unbuckled his pants. His well-toned body was all I had thought it would be. I made a soft sound of impatience and waited for him to make the final move. I glanced up to his face. I licked my lips and my eyes couldn't wait to feast on the object I knew was waiting. My tongue began to swirl around. I was in heaven trying to give him all the pleasure I was feeling. Ben groaned in delight, but didn't let me get much further. I groaned in disappointment until he began to undress me. I would deny him nothing. Ben pushed me gently onto my side while he moved behind me. It took only minutes for the first to hit me, but Ben wasn't done. The pleasure was incredible, and I let out that was loud enough to be heard in the adjoining rooms. I didn't care. The pleasure was intense, and I reveled in it. I was lost for minutes in the feeling, and I kept my tightly closed and my hands on his to keep the feeling going. It seemed like hours later that I finally came to my senses. The feelings from that memory were so intense that Annabeth had to stop. She was overwhelmed by fear that she had destroyed what she had with Ben. The pain was so intense that she broke down in tears and her head dropped to the table, crying again uncontrollably. Ben Chase. I woke just once sometime after dark and took a minute before realizing where I was. Since the house was quiet and dark, I assumed that my host was asleep and it was night. I lay there for a few minutes just trying to feel something other than the pain, but that was all I had. I closed my eyes again and tried to think of a warm beach on a clear blue ocean in a tropical resort, but saw only my wife being effed by another man. I squeezed my eyes shut and bit down on my lip so the pain would break my thoughts. It worked, and I let the physical pain overcome the mental. I fell asleep trying to keep them separate. The next time I woke, it was daytime, and the sun was coming in the gaps around the blinds drawn over the window. I thought I could smell coffee, and I swung my legs out of the bed and onto the soft carpeted floor. I sat there, trying to wake up, and finally rose to try to find a John to relieve quite a few hours of piss. I walked out of the room and saw the John to the left down a short hall. I shuffled to the door and found a neat bathroom with the ubiquitous Guest soaps and Guest towels. Whatever. I needed to piss, and then to splash some water on my face, which I proceeded to do. I noticed the shower and a couple of nice bath towels and thought, what the hell? I took a nice hot shower with a cold rinse, and I felt like a new man. I dried myself off with one of the nice fluffy towels and dressed in my dirty clothes. Well, at least the body was clean. I found Bill in the kitchen, and he greeted me with a mug of hot black coffee. I took the mug gratefully and sipped the strong liquid, feeling some life flow into me. I raised my head and looked at him to see him watching me. I hope I hadn't said anything too bad last night, but the way I was feeling, I could have. But as I returned his gaze, I saw only friendliness and interest. I now remembered I had begun to tell him my story. I think it had finally caught up with me during my telling, and I don't remember much after that. Well, Bill, what did I do and how bad was it? I guess I don't remember much about last night except that you were there and we started talking. Did I tell you much before I passed out? You were fine, Ben, and we got along great. You were telling me about your folks, and we had just begun to get into things when everything finally came down on your shoulders. I just brought you here, gave you a bite to eat, and then helped you to bed before you collapsed right here on the floor. Looks like the rest did you good. How do you feel this morning? 1,000% better than yesterday, that's for sure. I appreciate what you did for me, and I apologize for putting you through that. You had no need to do that for someone you don't even know. Well, it's sort of what I used to do. I'm a psychiatrist, or at least I used to be. Haven't practiced for over 2 years, but you caught my interest, and truth be told, I was bored to death. So, I don't think I was doing you any favors. It was more selfish than that. Well, I appreciate the bed and the food, but I don't want to impose. I'll just be heading out if you can point me in the direction of the bar where I believe I left my car. Well, I can do that, but to be honest, I do wish you would stay and finish your story. I was really caught up in your family and I was waiting for what was coming next. I'll make us some breakfast and we can eat and then go into what passes for my study, and you can finish telling me your story. Please think about it while I put on some bacon and eggs. Well, as he talked, most of last night came back to me, and I did remember telling him about my mom and dad and letting him read Mom's letter. I also remember feeling somewhat better after telling him what I did. Maybe I could stay, and we could talk. Could be something good could come from it, and I had nowhere else to go. As I thought that, I found I had no desire to talk to Beth, or to even call her. It was still too painful to go there. Bill was as good as his word, and we sat down to a huge breakfast of bacon, eggs, hash browns, and hot buttered toast. It went down real good, and I enjoyed every last bite. Bill put his share away as well, and he seemed to enjoy having the company. I remember he did say his wife had died a year or so ago, so I imagine he was quite lonely most of the time. No kids and no relatives close by, he said. Well, we finished. I helped clear the table and dry while he washed, and we took our coffee into the room he called his study. It was dark, warm, and gave me a good feeling as I sat down in a soft leather chair, while Bill took the swivel chair behind the desk. He looked right at home, so I could see him practicing his craft from here. Well, can you tell me where I left off last night before I made a fool of myself? I just don't remember much after giving you Mom's letter. You told me you had graduated as a chemical engineer and had seen a lot of the world but wanted to settle down at home. I remembered now. I had taken Mom's letter back and folded it neatly into its dog-eared envelope and put it back in my jacket pocket. That's when the fatigue hit me and I almost lost it. Okay, I would start there and see what came out. The company I worked for put me to work directing new construction projects around the East Coast. We had several new refineries and cracking facilities going in, and I had lots of experience in those areas, so I moved around the area, looking at sites, organizing contractors, setting up schedules, and in general coordinating. I was a good coordinator. Easy to work with, quick to adjust to changes, and just hard-assed enough to get the job done without pissing everyone off. I did quite well financially, and I was able to put a lot away for the proverbial rainy day. Things were very good. That's when I met Annabeth Foster. Beth was a realtor, and she and I met on the job. I had dealings with her, and we got to know each other really well over a period of several weeks, and I finally asked her out. We dated for some time, and we both knew it was serious. I finally proposed to her about 6 months later, and she accepted. We were married in 1997, in Chester, where we still live. Or at least we used to. I don't know anymore. I stopped to take a drink of the coffee, but found it cold. I told Bill to hold on till I got a refill. It gave me time to swallow the bile that threatened to come up into my mouth. I took several deep breaths and held my breath until my stomach quieted down again. The coffee suddenly didn't appeal to me, so I left the cup in the kitchen and picked up a glass of water instead. I went back in and sat down. Bill took one look, and I think he guessed what had happened. But to his credit, he said nothing. My job takes me away from home several times a month. I'm usually not very far, but sometimes I just choose to stay in a motel rather than make the long drive home. Since I have to turn right around the next day, it's simpler. Beth hates it, but it is a lot easier on me that way. I've been doing that since we were married 8 years ago, and she knew it going in. But lately she's been complaining more and more about it. So I try to limit my trips, but it wasn't enough apparently. I had to stop for a moment since my anger had flared up during that last thought. I still wanted to tell my story to Bill, but I had to bite down on my anger, or else it would just become a bitching session. Anyway, Beth and I had discussed kids, but neither of us really wanted them. She thought maybe later on, but I don't think she was serious. We've been lucky so far that she hasn't gotten pregnant. Our life has always been great. We made out on our first date, and we have been lovers ever since. We have it maybe 2 times a week and often more than that. Beth is easy to arouse, and she had no trouble coming to an ending or two during our lovemaking. I'm sorry for wandering around on you, Bill, but it's getting harder and harder as I get closer and closer to what happened. I hope you can stay with me. I'll get there, I promise. Bill Austin. I could see that Ben was struggling as he began to get closer in time to the event that triggered his traumatic flight from his home. I had not had to guide or steer him so far, and he seemed to have a natural flair for telling a story. If he could go through without guidance from me, the story would be closer to how he saw it rather than how I directed him to see it. Right now, he was breathing a little hard, and I could see the pain in his face as events got more and more stressful. I thought this might be a good time to take a break. Why don't we stop for a few minutes to get some iced tea? I have a gallon of sweet tea in the refrigerator, and it's really good. I'll get some ice, and we can take a walk around the yard till you feel calm enough to continue. I know this can be very stressful, and it's important that you remain as calm as possible so we can get the truth about everything. What do you mean, the truth? Why would I lie to you? I don't even know you well enough to be talking to you, but for some reason I want to. Strange, but true. Anyway, I won't lie. Not intentionally, but the mind plays tricks when it's in pain. I don't mean you would lie about anything, but stress may make you say things you don't mean or interpret things in a way that is incorrect. Let's just take the time, okay? Ben agreed, so I got us both a glass of iced tea, and we took it out the back door and onto my little deck. We stood at the railing and gazed at the trees lining the back of my lot. Behind the trees were woods, deep and old. I had investigated some of the trails running away into the woods, but they led nowhere. It was pleasant just to stand and watch the wind toss the leaves, making silver flashes when the undersides turned over. We stood there for 10 minutes or so, and I could see Ben begin to relax. It was good to see some peace come over him. I answered some of his questions about me when he started to ask. It was no secret, so I answered him as truthfully as possible. He seemed interested, and we talked about me for a little while. We stayed out there for some time, until it began to get a little chilly. It was warm for September, but not for someone my age. I led Ben back into the warm kitchen, and we sat at the kitchen table, a little more casual than my study. This way, Ben might remain more relaxed. I would urge Ben to begin his story again with a more relaxed attitude. Annabeth Chase. Remembering the past wasn't doing me any good. Why think about what I had instead of how I screwed it up? I know I screwed up big time, but I don't know why. How in the hell did it get to this point in my life? I loved Ben with all my heart, and he is the only man I have ever loved. I loved him from the first date, and I've never wavered once. Even when we argued and fought, I never felt differently. I could get angry and yell at him, but I always knew that he would be there for me if I needed or wanted him. He felt the same about me, I was sure. But now, I honestly didn't know what he felt. All I could remember was the look on his face when he came into the bedroom and saw me and George together. Even now, 3 days later, I could see his face. I saw it in my dreams, when I closed my eyes or when I looked in the mirror. The pain, the disappointment, and the anger all there in his eyes as he watched George Jenkins F me from behind. I thought again about how it had come to be. George and I flirted outrageously during our times together at the Manor House. He always found a way to be next to me in the serving line, and he made it a point to press against me in different ways, reaching across me for something, reaching over to point to something, handing me a spoon or ladle with our hands touching longer than necessary. I understood what he was doing even then, but I didn't object or even try to stop it. I loved the flirting and the implied promise, even though I never intended to keep it. It was just a game, an innocent game with a cute man who was interesting and interested in me. I was flattered and somewhat aroused by the thought, but I never intended anything other than innocent fun. The last time we had worked together was just a week ago Wednesday. I was serving the potatoes and George was handling the vegetables. We had been serving and laughing while working, and there was a lot of touching and bumping. It was always crowded behind the counter, but not that crowded. But I enjoyed it as always and did my share of touching as well. Things were fun until the rush died and George and I were relieved to take a break. Since George smoked, I often accompanied him outside in the back so he could have his cigarette. I didn't mind as Ben still smoked a little. I was leaning against the wall, enjoying the feel of the warm September sun on my face with my eyes closed. George had pulled out his cigarettes and his lighter, and I waited for the metallic click of the metal top, thinking of nothing in particular. Just as I was about to ask him something, I felt his lips on mine. The shock was intense, but the feeling of pleasure was something I was unprepared for. I felt a warm tingle in my lips as he kissed me with more intensity. I responded and kissed him back. As I enjoyed the unfamiliar feelings, his tongue pushed against my lips and I opened to him. The pleasure intensified as we kissed, and I felt his arms come around me and pull my body tight against his. I was almost lost in the sensations. I was totally relaxed in his arms, and I murmured his name into his mouth when I suddenly realized what I was doing. I knew it was wrong, but it felt so good. I wanted this to continue, but I knew it couldn't, at least not here. I pushed back, away from his body and his kiss, and held out my hand to stop him. Then the guilt began. What the hell was I doing? This was not my husband. This was another man, and I had let my body betray me into feelings and desires that were wrong. Wrong. I tried to say something to George, but the words couldn't make their way through my tightened throat. I was having difficulty breathing, and I finally just turned away and ran back through the door into the storeroom, where I grabbed my coat and purse and, mumbling something to the first person I saw, left. I found my car and drove home almost on instinct. Once home, I ran into the bathroom, tore off my clothes and staggered into the shower where I let the hot water run and run, cleaning my deceitful body of those desires and sensations that shamed me. I finally calmed down enough to begin dinner for Ben while I fought hard to put the whole episode out of my mind. I was ashamed of what I had done, but at the same time, exhilarated, and I knew then that I could no longer work at the Manor House with George. I had lost control of myself today, and there was no assurance that it wouldn't happen again in the same circumstances. I had no control and no thoughts while it was happening, and it could have gotten much worse. No, I had to quit. I would call tomorrow and let them know. With that decision made, I felt much better, and when Ben came home, I was in a good mood. We ate a nice meal, watched some television, and went to bed where I made Ben very, very happy. It had been a long time since I had given him a BJ and let him return the favor, but that night I did that and more. It was great and Ben was content. Only once did I have a thrill of fear when he asked me what had gotten into me. I just laughed and said I had watched an opera that turned me on. He let it go. I resigned as I planned, and things seemed to calm down over the next few weeks. Ben had been working on a project close to Chester where we lived, and he was always home by 5 o'clock or 5:30 p.m. Things were good and I was content. The episode with George gradually faded to a pleasant memory, and I began to consider other things to do with my time. Maybe a garden? Something close to home? Something safe? Well, I had some ideas and I would let them develop. It was a week later when Ben told me that he had to drive over to a town called Ambridge in the western part of the state. I was a little upset, reminding him that we had planned to meet Roger and Stacy for dinner. They were two of our best friends, and we often went out to dinner together. When he looked at me like I was just a little slow and said to call them and cancel, I got angry. I couldn't understand how he could be so unconcerned. This was too much like it had been before, and it was too much for me to take without comment. I remember getting into it with him, and I think I was overreacting when I screamed at him, telling him he was an insensitive prick. I think those were the words. I know I started to cry, and I finally just ran to our bedroom and lay there on the bed sobbing uncontrollably. While I was there, Ben left to go to work. That's how we left it. I stayed there until my anger cooled and then went outside to my new project, a fish pond with outdoor goldfish. Ben had helped me install it, and we had planted a nice border around it with a bench to sit and watch. It was a beautiful little place, and Ben and I both loved it already, but now it had lost some of its glamour. I was still angry, and I wanted Ben to understand that he had to begin to put me first, rather than his job. Maybe I was being selfish, but there it was. I was going to have it out with him when he got back from this trip. Bill was right. The walk and the fresh air did a lot of good for my mind and body. I didn't realize how tight and tense I was until the warm sun relaxed my bunched muscles and the constant crick in my neck began to loosen. As we walked and talked about nothing in particular, I began to wonder a little about my host. Here I was, a stranger from a bar, walking and talking and, in general, sharing my most intimate life with a man that I knew nothing about, other than the little he told me. The fact that I believed him without thought was strange in itself. Maybe now was the time for some question for him. Tell me a little about yourself, Bill. You say you were married for a long time? Yes, my wife Mary and I were married for a little over 42 years. We met in college and married after graduation, back in '61. She taught school right here in Dayton while I opened a practice later after I finished my internship at a hospital in Fort Wayne. We were very happy here, and neither of us ever wanted to see other parts of the world. Oh, we took the vacations to Mexico and Canada and once to Bermuda, but other than that, this was our world. How did she die? Was it an illness, or do you mind my asking? Mary died of cancer about a year ago. She died at home in bed, with me lying next to her. She died in her sleep. I remember waking up and knowing right away that she was gone. When you sleep with someone for that many years, you know right away. Bill retreated into his own memories then, and we just walked together for another 10 minutes before Bill stopped and turned around. I think it's time we got back. It's getting a little chilly. It was very warm for September, but I followed him back inside. It was time to get on with it. Where was I? Oh yes, I remember. I was telling you about our life and our life together. Well, as I said, Beth and I enjoyed it with each other, and we were sort of adventurous. We did a little of everything at least once, and we finally found those things we liked. We stayed with them, varying a little for fun. Beth liked giving and receiving BJ, and so did I, so that became a staple of our lovemaking. She also liked missionary best, so that was our choice. We never got into it, and neither of us missed it. But overall, our love life was great. One of the things Beth hated was my traveling. I didn't do a lot of it, but from time to time I had to take some overnights, and sometimes I would stay a few days, just because it was easier on me than a lot of back and forth driving. Beth never liked being alone, and neither did I, but I thought that the way I did it was best because I could be home more that way. Beth never saw it that way though. She always complained, mostly to make sure I knew how she felt. Never got into a heated argument about it until this last time. I had forgotten that we had dinner plans with our friends that night. I knew that I had to make the trip because I had a phone call earlier in the morning telling me of a major snafu that was going to cause a huge delay in the project if it didn't get fixed. That would mean a whole lot more of my time spent away on the site, so the only way to fix it was for me to make the trip and talk to the local contractor and see if there was something I could do to make him change his mind. I had the authority to make a deal right then and there, so I had no choice. But when I started to tell Beth, she blew up and started in on me. She wasn't going to listen to reason, and she had made up her mind that I did this just to piss her off. She was calling me names, and honestly, it pissed me off as well, so I just told her to shove it. Well, we really got into it, and she finally started crying, and she ran up to the bedroom and slammed the door. Rather than try to make it up to her, I was angry, so I just left without a word. That's how we ended it that day. But I felt so bad that I drove down to my office and spent a good 2 to 3 hours on the phone trying to see if there was any way in the world that I could avoid that trip. I called everyone connected with anyone and tried to make a deal that would avoid the delay, keep the project on budget, and allow me to stay home and make that dinner with Roger and Stacy and make Beth forgive me. It was on my mind, and I was determined to make it right. Well, perseverance and patience paid off, and by 11:30 that morning, I had made the deal and the project would proceed on schedule. The deal I made was very good, if I do say so myself, and I was quite proud of my incredible negotiation skills. I couldn't wait to tell Beth. I picked up the phone but then thought, what the hell? I left the office, went down the street to a florist that I had seen, and bought a bouquet of fresh-cut flowers. I decided to surprise Beth with a bouquet and an apology in person. Annabeth Chase. I sat down in front of the pond and just watched the golden flashes as the fish darted through the crystal-clear water. The new pump and filter set Ben brought home last week was doing the job of keeping the water clear and clean. The goldfish seemed to like it. I just let my mind calm while I watched them. I was just drifting when I heard a voice from the side of the house. I looked up to see George Jenkins coming around the side. George, what are you doing here? Where did you come from? I'm sorry, Annabeth. I didn't mean to startle you. I knocked but no one answered, so I remembered you talking about your fish and decided to walk around to see if you might be out here, and here you are. What are you doing here, George? I don't think it's a good idea for you to be here. I wish you would just go. Please, Annabeth. I just wanted to apologize for what happened and plead with you to forgive me. I value our friendship and I couldn't bear it if we couldn't have that back. There's nothing to forgive, George. Now, please, just go away. Please. Rather than leave as I asked, George just came over to the bench and sat down beside me. He took my face in his hand and tilted it up to look into my eyes. I won't leave until you forgive me, Annabeth. Will you do that? I looked into those eyes and I was lost. I couldn't speak as he held my face in his hand. As I began to shiver, he bent down and kissed me just as he had the last time we were together. God forgive me. I kissed him back. He rose from the bench and took my hands in his and pulled me up. He put his arm around my waist and led me back up the stairs into the kitchen. Once we were inside, he began to kiss me again, and now I gave in willingly. I felt his hands unbutton my blouse. He slid his hand. He slid my blouse off my shoulders and down my arms. He now used both hands on my exposed chest, and the pleasure I felt was agonizing. Why don't we take this into the bedroom? I want to make love to you, my Beth. Let me give you the pleasure you deserve. I took his hand and pulled him up the stairs to our bedroom. I had a momentary thought of Ben, but it disappeared in a flash of anger. This was his fault for not being here where he belonged. As I walked to the bed, I turned and began to remove his shirt just as he had mine. We proceeded to undress each other, and soon we were both naked and ready. I sat down on the edge of the bed and took it in my hand. It was shorter than Ben's. I have to admit that at that point, I wasn't thinking. I was just reacting to, and there was nothing of love in it. It was simply lust, and I gave into it. Ben was not even in my mind. I wasn't cheating on him because at that point in time, he didn't exist for me. Only George, and his was real. Then I pushed him away and moved back up on the bed. I wanted George to F me now and hard. George was willing and ready. I lay back and waited. It was incredible. We lay together, George on top and me underneath him. I gave him some verbal encouragement, urging him on, which seemed to do the trick. He was slamming and I stopped pushing back since he had it under control. I was just beginning to feel an ending approach when I heard something. I looked toward the door and saw Ben. Ben Chase. I drove home with the flowers and an apology, which I continued to practice as I drove. I needed to make sure that Beth heard me loud and clear. I wanted nothing to come between her and I and our marriage. If the job was becoming too much, I would look for something else. I just needed her to know that, and to know that I loved her enough to do anything I could to make her happy. I would do it for her. I pulled into our drive and noticed the dark blue Range Rover parked out in front of the house. I didn't recognize it, but that wasn't unusual. We often had people parking in front of our house when there was a party in the neighborhood, or if someone was visiting the neighbors across the street, they had to park in the direction of travel or else get a ticket, so sometimes people just parked and walked across the street. Either way, it was not in my way, so I just ignored it. I took my flowers and walked into the house. It was quiet, which meant that Beth was probably upstairs in the spare room working on some of her signs and plaques for one of her charities. She spent a lot of time up there, so we had it fixed up quite nicely, with lots of light and plenty of shelves for her stuff. I went up the stairs quietly so as to surprise her. When I reached the landing at the top of the stairs, I started toward the right where the spare room was located when I heard sounds coming from our bedroom. I stopped and moved that way, holding the flowers out in front of me as a peace offering. I tiptoed my way to the door and looked in. What I saw almost caused me a heart attack. The picture is burned into my mind. I can't make it go away. It is as clear as a photograph and as hard to look at as a train wreck. But I'll describe it for you. I saw two people on our bed. The man was on his knees. He had his hands on Beth's hips. Beth was on her hands and knees. With her head down on the pillow, I vaguely remember hearing her saying something. His face was contorted, mostly in pleasure, I imagine. I didn't recognize him. That is the picture that I have ingrained into my brain. My wife, another man in our bed. It wasn't RP, and it wasn't a mistake. She was enjoying it. I could tell that from her face. It was all I needed to see. I threw the flowers away, turned and ran down the stairs to my car. I got in, started driving, and ended up here 2 days later. I haven't called or let her know where I am, and I don't want to. I don't know what I want to do. I know what my dad did, and now I know why. That was my story. I looked at Bill and was surprised to see his eyes shining with unshed tears. He had listened carefully and quietly to my story, and I had to admit that I felt much better now that I had told someone. I slumped down in my chair. Beth Chase. The shock of seeing Ben standing there was more than I could process. I just gaped at him with my mouth open, no words coming to mind. I was stunned. Ben? My Ben? He wasn't supposed to be home. He was driving west towards some godforsaken place in western Pennsylvania. I hadn't seen him, had I? Suddenly I realized what I was doing and what Ben saw when he looked in the doorway. I felt George behind me, while I knelt there on my hands and knees loving it. The panic hit, and I almost lost it. The sudden jolt to my system gave me the strength to rise up and throw George off of me, and ran to the doorway in time to see Ben's departing back as he went down the stairs and out the door. I was moving to try to stop him when I stepped on flowers scattered on the floor. I stopped as if I had run into a brick wall. I looked down at the bouquet of flowers, now spread across the hall, and I collapsed. I slid down to the floor, and the immensity of what I had done came down on my shoulders like a weight I couldn't support, crushing me down until I couldn't breathe. I struggled to find some air, but nothing was happening. I couldn't move, I couldn't cry, and I couldn't call for help. I just sat there, slumped against the wall, my bare feet surrounded by the blossoms of the flowers Ben had brought me. George came out into the hall, asking me what had just happened. He hadn't seen Ben, and he didn't know why I had run out of the room. I heard his voice, asking me what was wrong and what happened. I couldn't answer him. I just sat there leaning against the wall, my body obscenely visible to him. Suddenly, the whole thing became nothing more than a disgusting episode of a cheating wife a man she hardly knew in the bed she shared with her husband. Now the truth came back, and the truth made me sick. I scrambled up and ran to the bathroom, sick to my stomach and sick at heart. I closed and locked the door, turning to the commode just in time. When George came down to knock and ask if I was all right, I just cowered there on the bathroom floor, not answering until he went away. I stayed there for the next hour until I felt it was safe to come out. George had gone, thank God. I ran the shower on full hot and stood there letting it wash the shame away. I had no answers to give to Ben should he care enough to ask. I had no idea why I had done what I did with George there in our bed in our home. I had shame enough to fill the hole in my heart, but no answers. I didn't even know where Ben was, or when he would come back, if ever. Ben was not a man to accept what I had done. I had no choice now but to wait for his judgment. Bill Austin. It was clear to me now what Ben was feeling. His mother had betrayed his father, and the father was unable to come to grips with it. In the end, he decided to take his own life rather than try to face the reality of what his wife had done. Ben at that age knew nothing about fidelity or cheating, and all he saw was that his father had left him behind. That was all the reality a boy his age could understand. Further, because of the trauma of her part in her husband's death, the mother fought a losing battle with guilt, remorse, and loss. She was also unable to face the pain that she had caused her husband, and she took her life as well. Both of these actions were interpreted by Ben as desertion. Both his parents had deserted him and left him to fend for himself. He grew up believing that, never knowing the real story until he reached 18. By that time, the man he was to become had already been formed. The truth then was more academic than anything else. Annabeth, Ben's wife, had cheated on him with another man. Ben had to come to grips with that somehow, but his coping mechanisms were formed all those years ago in a house with very similar circumstances. But even though he now understood the reasons for his parents' actions, he subconsciously saw only the facts. His mother cheated, causing his father's death. His father's death caused his mother to kill herself. Now, his wife had cheated. His course of action was suggesting itself even now. That's why I told Beth that she had best stay away from Ben now. His actions were going to be difficult to predict given his history. Beth obviously wasn't aware of that part of his past, and she didn't understand the irony of what she did. Infidelity was bad enough, but to a man with Ben's past, it could be deadly. It was very likely that someone was going to be hurt. I looked at the clock, surprised to find that we had talked away the morning and part of the afternoon. I finally got up telling Ben that we should get some dinner and then talk some more. When he told me that I had heard all of his story, I just laughed and said that we had so much more to talk about now that I knew his background. It caused him to tense up a little, but I assured him that we would not be doing any really deep stuff and that he was only a little crazy. That got a laugh, so I let it slide for now. I thought that we could go back to the bar where we met yesterday for some dinner and a few beers. Ben was certainly more relaxed now, and I wanted to keep him that way. Ben Chase. Telling Bill my story had really wiped me out. I was as tired as if I had spent the day working in the mill like my daddy. My back was sore, my legs ached, and I felt as though I could sleep for a month. Part of that was tension, part fatigue, and part emotion. I didn't know which was which. I was just beat. When Bill suggested that we had more to talk about, I guess I didn't want to hear that, but then he broke the tension with his crazy comment and then suggested we go out to eat. I could eat, and I wanted a beer in the worst way. So off we went. At the bar, things seemed about the same. It was later now than it had been when I first met Bill, and there were many more people around. Seems Bill knew a lot of them since there were greetings flying all over the place. He seemed to be very popular, a regular. I watched him interact with several and found him to be smooth and easygoing. That was my impression of him too, so I guess he was just what he seemed. We moved to a table and Bill ordered burgers and onion rings for both of us with a cold beer. I relaxed back and looked around. I watched several nice-looking women move in on some of the guys and concluded that they were pros. When I mentioned it to Bill, he just nodded affirmatively and let it go. Fine with me. While I was downing the burger, I saw a well-dressed woman about my age come into the bar, look around, and then move onto a stool. She was quite good-looking and very polished. She looked different than most of the pros, and I watched as several guys made a move on her, all of which she rebuffed. Interested, I began to watch to see what she was doing. I noticed a man at the other end of the bar looking in her direction, but otherwise making no move. Now I was fascinated and continued to watch. My curiosity was rewarded when she nodded her head slightly in his direction, slid off the stool, and went toward the restrooms. The man at the bar followed. I told Bill that I wanted to use the restrooms and followed them. I hung back, watched as they came together in the hall, not noticing me pressed back against the wall in the shadows. They whispered, and then she reached out her hand and pressed it lightly against his cheek. That's when I noticed the wedding ring. She moved away and walked back to the bar. He did the same, except that he put some money on the bar and went out the door rather than return to his seat. Within a minute, the woman left as well. I knew that I had just witnessed a clandestine meeting, and the woman was probably married and wanted to meet her lover. They had come here separately and then left to be together. I knew that somewhere, some man was being CC, just like me. All of a sudden, the pain and grief that I felt that night at home came crashing back. Along with the pain came a feeling of rage. Rage so intense at the stupid bee and her lover. What in the hell were they doing? Someone should teach them both a lesson. I gasped, struggling to breathe, and I felt the blood drain from my head. I was almost in danger of passing out when I rose from my seat to almost run from the bar into the cool night air. I crashed out the door, looked around for them, but they were gone. Suddenly the rage just evaporated and I staggered to one side and bent over, trying to catch my breath. The hamburger I had just enjoyed came back up in an explosive purging. I heaved everything I had and continued to heave, cramps clutching at my gut till I cried out in pain. I was sweating and fighting for control when I felt Bill's hand on my shoulder. "Don't fight it, Ben. Let it control you first. Let it run its course. You have no choice but to allow it free rein. It will pass. Just let it go. Don't fight it. Just breathe. Easy breaths, easy breaths." His words didn't mean much, but his soothing voice helped. The rage which had threatened to overcome me had disappeared. I forgot the pain and the discomfort and concentrated on his voice. "Don't fight. Let go." Over and over until I could finally hear the words and begin to follow his advice. I was shivering uncontrollably, but the cramps began to loosen. Blood began to flow into my brain again, and I was able to straighten up and lean against the cool bricks of the outside wall of the bar. Things began to register, and I felt the coils of tension loosen and finally break free. I took several deep breaths, bringing oxygen back to my starving lungs. The shivers passed, and I saw Bill standing there with a worried look on his face. I tried to smile at him. "I'll be okay now. It's passing and I feel much better. Sorry I scared you. Can you tell me what happened? Do you know what set this off? It's important to tell me what happened. Can you do that?" I shook my head yes and took a couple of deep breaths, feeling the bands around my chest slip away and my breathing become normal again. I was watching a woman at the bar. She was my age, quite pretty and well-dressed. She wasn't a pro because she rebuffed several of the guys who tried to pick her up. I noticed a man at the other end of the bar, and I saw them looking at each other. I followed them when they went toward the restrooms, and I saw them kiss and exchange words. Then he left the bar, and she followed within a few minutes. I knew then that they were meeting and that she was cheating on her husband. That's all I remember, till now. Bill was shaking his head in apparent understanding. He must have known who she was since he never bothered to say anything when he saw me looking at her. He seemed to be satisfied about what I told him, but for the life of me, I didn't know why. But he decided it was time for us to head back to his place, and that's what we did. Bill Austin. Once Ben told me what he had experienced and what brought it on. I knew that my original opinion was correct. Ben was very close to moving in the direction his subconscious was pulling him, and violence was not that far away. I saw the fury in his eyes just before he got up to run out the door. Had he found them, I was sure that he would have done violence. I was sure that he also felt the misery that had driven him to me, and I knew he had to fight to stay sane, but his coping tools were sadly incapable of handling this. I had to do something. Ben was able to calm down on the walk back to my place. He had suffered 2 major shocks to his system in less than 72 hours, and it was beginning to have an effect on him. I knew that without my help, he was moving more and more toward taking some drastic action. I was afraid that given his past, harm to himself was high on his list, even if he didn't see it for himself. I could see it building. Something had to be done. Annabeth Chase. I was still waiting for a call back from the man that called yesterday. He said Ben was with him, and that it wasn't smart for me to talk with him just yet. I didn't agree, but since I didn't know who he was or where he and Ben were, I had no choice. I didn't know what else to do but wait. I had called the Manor House and told them I couldn't help them anymore. George had called me 3 or 4 times now, and I asked him each time not to call me again. This last time, I finally told him that Ben had seen us that time, and George was shocked. He wanted to know what Ben said, and I told him that Ben had left me and hadn't called me at all since. George was very sad to hear that, but then he asked me if I wanted to get together again. I told him that my marriage was the only thing on my mind right now, and that was all I was concerned with. He promised to keep in touch, but I just hung up without replying. I had spent the last day wondering what the man meant when he asked me about Ben's parents. What in the world did that have to do with anything? I couldn't remember Ben saying anything other than they were killed in an accident. What kind of accident? I didn't know, and Ben never said. Maybe it was important. I thought about it and then decided to take a chance and call Pearl, Ben's grandmother. I could ask her if she had any more information. That decided, I found her number and used my cell to call her. I wanted to keep the phone open in case the man called again. I reached Pearl at her home and talked with her for a few minutes. It was hard since we didn't have much in common, and she and I had never formed a bond. Ben was her only concern, and she didn't have much left for others, including me. But she was civil, and I finally asked her about Ben's parents. Her response was weird. She first asked me where Ben was. When I told her he was out of town on a job, she asked several questions, indicating she didn't believe me. She then asked me what he had told me, and I said that he indicated they died in an accident. She was quiet at that, but finally asked me if I had some time to come over to her place for a talk. I quickly agreed, intrigued now with her attitude. When I arrived about an hour later, she was waiting for me. She asked me to sit in the little family room of her home and brought in a plate of cookies and a pot of tea. We sat and she poured, just like a little old lady of money. I knew that she came from a poor family, so I assumed that there were effects that she had learned to try to rise above her early life. She seemed comfortable with it, so I accepted her offer of tea. Now then, why this sudden interest in our Ben's family? Has something happened to make you curious? No, not really. Someone asked me about it the other day, and I realized I knew very little. Ben never seemed comfortable talking about it, so I decided to ask you. I don't think he would mind. I'm sure he would mind, but that's not important. What happened is important, and the reason for you asking might be very important. Did you do something that made Ben leave home? How in the hell did she know? Was it a lucky guess? I decided to continue with my bluff and see. Nothing happened. Ben is on a job, like I said. I just wanted to know what really happened. I don't believe you, girl. I don't know you well at all, but I can tell when someone's lying. What did you do to make him run? Shit. I had to tell her something, so I decided on the truth. Maybe she would be shocked enough to tell me what really happened. So, I told her, and she listened grimly when I got to the part about Ben seeing us together. That's when I knew there was trouble. Pearl just glared at me when I was finished, and then she shook her head. Okay, here's what happened. And you had best listen carefully, cause you've opened a big can of worms. Here goes. Ben's mom and dad both KD themselves. His dad first when he was 8 and his mom a year later. That's why I raised him from 9 years old on. He never knew what happened until later when he turned 18. By then he was already formed, and it didn't make no mind. I don't understand. What does that have to do with me and what Ben saw? Pauline, Ben's mother, my daughter, cheated on his father, Howard. Pauline told Howard about it, and it broke his heart. He tried to deal with it, but he couldn't. He waited about 2 months and then put a shotgun and pulled the trigger. Pauline found him that way, coming home from her work. Seems he left her a note, but she told me the note was very bad and she tore it up rather than keep it. But it was already too late. Pauline tried to keep it together and raise Ben, but she couldn't get over what she had done to Howard. She wrote Ben a letter, explaining it all, and then KD herself. She bled to D, laying there plain as day for her son to find. My God, that's insane. How could they do that to a little boy, leaving him alone like that? What was the matter with them? I was appalled at the cruelty of what they did until I suddenly realized the implications. Ben had witnessed me doing the same thing his mother had. I had cheated on him, just as his mother cheated on his father. I looked at Pearl, understanding now what she was trying to tell me. Oh my God, what have I done? More than you know, girl. Ben grew up believing his parents had left him behind intentionally. He was angry with them, and he never forgave either of them. Once he read the letter, he could understand what they did, but it was too late and he didn't accept it. They left him. That's all he knew, and it started with his mother's betrayal of his father. Now do you see? I saw and I understood. I knew now what the man meant when he asked me those questions and told me to stay away right now. He knew. Ben must have told him. He must have thought that I cheated knowing the history. He must have thought me cruel and stupid. But really wasn't I? Ben Chase. Bill wanted to talk some more that evening, but I didn't. I was feeling a little funny now, and maybe that was because everything was finally beginning to sink in. I was no longer angry at Beth. She wasn't worth my anger. She was just a cheating spouse, and they were all too common. Just common whores, just like my mother. And just like my mother, Beth had destroyed our marriage. Well, I would deal with her, but not like my father. He took the easy way out. I wouldn't. Beth would pay. Bill Austin. Ben was far too calm and quiet for my taste. I wanted to talk, but he seemed to be too withdrawn and refused to be drawn into a conversation. It worried me a lot, but I couldn't force him. Maybe by tomorrow, he would be in a better frame of mind. I'd wait and see. When Ben bid me good night, I relaxed a little. A good night's sleep would be good for him, and we could go into some things tomorrow. Ben Chase. I got up early while it was still dark. Bill was asleep as I collected my things and carried them out to my car. I had decided last night to end this farce. I had to go back to Chester to set things right and make sure Beth paid. It was the right thing to do. When I made the decision, it just felt right and my stomach relaxed and I felt calm. I was quiet since I didn't want to try to explain to Bill what I was going to do. I did write him a note, giving him my address in Chester so that he could send me a bill for all I owed him. I decided that was only fair since he had gone to so much trouble for me. I left that morning at just before 6 a.m. and it felt good to be heading home. I pulled onto the interstate and set the cruise control and tried to make my plans. It had to be done right away. She couldn't be allowed too much time to try to make it more difficult. I wanted to have it done. I smiled as I anticipated the pain she would feel when I delivered the killing blow. Maybe she could begin to experience some of what I was feeling. I doubted it since she apparently didn't have any feelings for me. If she had, she could never have done that to me. Well, she wouldn't be able to do it much longer. I would see to that. I drove straight through, taking just under 2 days to return home. I used my cell to call work and tell them that I was taking 2 weeks emergency leave to attend to personal matters. I left all the necessary instructions to make sure my people could carry on with the project. Once that was taken care of, I called a few other people that I needed to complete my plans. I would deal with them in person once I got back in town. The last thing I did was make a reservation at the Holiday Inn Express just off the interstate and just 7 miles from my house. I wasn't going to let Beth know I was back in town. I wanted to make sure she stayed home where I could find her when it was time. Time for her to pay the final price for her treachery. Dad made a mistake, but I wouldn't. He had hurt himself over her betrayal instead of her, but not me. No, sir. She was the one that had to pay. Bill Austin. When I found the note and Ben gone, I knew I had to call Mrs. Chase and let her know that she might be in danger. I had the distinct impression that Ben had not intended to hurt himself. I feared rather for her. I feared he was going to try to harm his wife. I had to get word to her right away. It would take him some time to get home, and she could use the time to get away and go somewhere he couldn't harm her. I got the number from my office and called her again. She answered on the first ring. Hello? Is this you, Ben? Hello, Mrs. Chase, it's Bill Austin, the one that called you 2 days ago. Do you remember? Yes, of course. How is Ben? Is he there, and can I talk to him? I understand now what you were trying to ask me the last time, and I didn't know then, but I do now. Please, let me talk to him. It's important that I tell him what I must. Please. Mrs. Chase, listen to me. Ben isn't here now. He's on his way back to Chester, and I'm worried. He left me a note telling me that he's going to fix things right this time. He's referring to his father. I think he may be planning on harming you instead of himself as his father did. I believe he thinks his father was wrong in taking his own life. He feels that he should have done something to his mother instead. Do you understand me? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. I hoped that I had gotten through to her that she was in real danger. She had to believe that so she could take appropriate actions to protect herself. Ben wouldn't hurt me, Mr. Austin. I believe that with all my heart. I know Ben, and he isn't a violent person. He'll come home and let me explain. He is one of the most gentle and understanding men I have ever known. I believe in him, and I'll wait for him. But thank you for letting me know. Please, Mrs. Chase, don't be foolish. Ben is in shock now, and he is not predictable. I believe you are in danger. Please be careful. Thank you again, Mr. Austin. I'll be fine, and thank you for caring for Ben during this time. Goodbye. I tried to convince her to change her mind, but she had hung up. She didn't believe she was in danger, but I did. I couldn't call the police because I had no proof other than my gut feelings. I would wait a couple of days and call back. I would hope for the best till then. Annabeth Chase. I don't care what he said. Ben would never hurt me. Just because his father and Mother K themselves over an affair, that was not Ben. He would never do anything like that to me or to himself. I believe that. What I did with George was not an affair, at least not yet. We had just had the one day together if I didn't count the time at the Manor House. Whatever, Ben would forgive me, I was sure. If he was on his way home, I had to be ready for him. I needed to make sure I looked my best, and that there was plenty of beer and pizza in the fridge. That's what he liked when he wanted to relax and kick back. I wanted him relaxed and calm when we talked. I knew he would try to understand what I did, and he would forgive me. I needed to make a quick run to the store for the beer, and I would pick up a couple of frozen pizzas just in case. Ben Chase, are you sure you have everything? You know the address? You know that I want it done at exactly 8 p.m. tomorrow night? Okay, good. I'll call again tomorrow just before I leave. Perfect. Everything was in place. It had taken me 3 days to make the contacts and to get everything that was needed. I just wanted to make it all perfect. Beth needed to be surprised. This way she would not expect a thing. Just to be sure, I decided the time had come for me to call her and set everything up. It had to be done just right. I looked around the room, making sure I had everything packed and ready to take down to the car. I wouldn't check out until tomorrow morning, but I needed to be ready. I admit that I was higher than a kite, but what I had planned was really big. If everything worked according to plan, I would be at least 8 hours away when it happened. My contact was ready. He knew the time, and he knew what to do. I had been over this time and again in my mind, and I knew this is what I wanted. Dad had made a mistake and taken it out on himself instead of Mom. I wasn't going down that path. Beth had the affair, and she would pay. I was not to blame, so why should I hurt myself? That's the mistake Dad made, not me. Smiling, I reached for the phone and dialed. Hello? Ben? Yes, Beth, it's me. How are you? Oh my God, Ben. Where have you been? I've been dying waiting for you to come home. Are you coming home now? I need you here. Well, I'm not sure. It seems we have a problem. In case you don't remember, you were another man in our house and in our bed. Did you forget that, Beth? Did you forget that you are my wife and that other men is not permitted? Ben, please, come home so we can talk about this. I need to see you and explain to you what you saw. It's not what you think. Please, Ben, give me a chance to tell you my side. Are you saying that you weren't that man? It was someone else? No, Ben. Please come home. Come home now and let me explain. Please, Ben. Well, I guess maybe I didn't see things exactly right. Well, okay, if you think you can explain, then we should talk. Yes, we have to talk. Please come home now so we can talk. I am so afraid right now that you won't understand. I don't want to lose you. Come home now. No, I can't do it now. Will you be home tomorrow evening about 8 o'clock? I can come by then if that's okay. That's fine. That's perfect. I'll wait for you, and I'll have everything ready. Oh, thank you, Ben. I was so afraid I would lose you, and that would kill me. Be there at 8 p.m. tomorrow. Goodbye, Beth. With that, I hung up the phone before she could say any more. It was as I expected. She never once said anything about causing me pain. Only herself. She was worried about what she would lose, not whether I was okay or in pain. No mention of me and what I was feeling, only what she was feeling. Just like Mom. She screwed over my dad, and he KD himself. But she didn't KD herself over guilt, just self-pity. She only cared for herself, just like Beth. Fine. Beth would pay, just as my mother should have. I took my bags down to the car so that I would be ready for tomorrow. I wanted to check out before 11 a.m. and make a few stops before getting on the road. I needed some cash, and I needed to close some accounts. That would be easy, and I could get it all done in about an hour or so. I was ready. I decided to order pizza delivered to the room, and I could make a stop at the Kangaroo store next door to pick up some beer and fill the car with gas. I loved pizza and cold beer. God, it felt good to know what I was doing. Beth Austin. The phone call could have been worse, but at least he agreed to come home to let me explain. I had to be sure of what I said to him. He needed to know that I loved him and that I was sorry. I needed to explain to him that I was really upset with him when he left that day, and that I was still feeling hurt and angry when George stopped by. I didn't love George or feel anything for him. It was just thing, and it was because we had that fight. It was as much his fault as mine, but I was sorry, and it wouldn't happen again. I needed him to believe that. I thought about that and decided that I wouldn't mention the part about it being partly his fault. That was too much. Just that I was upset. That was better. If he could forgive me, we could get past it and go on. Ben would forgive me. I was positive of that. Ben was not a violent man, and he had incredible patience with me and my mistakes. This was just that, a mistake. A pleasant one for me, but a mistake that I wouldn't make again. But I wouldn't include that part, the pleasant part. George was a very good lover, and it was too bad it was a one-time thing. But it was over. I had my fun. I paid a price, and now it was time to get back on the path. I just had to wait now until tomorrow night. I was ready. Ben Chase. The accounts were closed. The money was transferred to a new account in a different bank, and I had made a cash withdrawal of $5,000, which I put into an envelope. That was to be left in a P.O. box at the post office indicated by J. D. Peterson, the gentleman taking care of tonight for me. Since we had never met in person, I was just as glad to leave the money there and be on my way. He knew what to do, where to go, and he had all he needed to finish the job. He was fine with it this way, as was I. I finished up my business and had an early lunch at a diner outside of town. It was just after 11:30 when I placed a call to Mr. Peterson. When he answered, I told him the money had been dropped in the mailbox he indicated and that I was ready to head out of town. He told me to have a safe trip and that he would call my new cell phone number when it was done. I told him to be sure that he arrived at the house at exactly 8 o'clock so that I would know when it went down. He agreed, told me to stop worrying and to have a safe trip. I had the waitress fix me a coffee to go and left the diner. I was on my way to Mexico and my new life. I wanted to be out of the States by tonight, so I had chartered a flight to Phoenix, Arizona, and I would cross over just south of Tucson into Nogales, Mexico. By 8 p.m., I should be there. I would be out of the jurisdiction of the U.S. courts, and I could lose myself for a long time. That was the plan. I had a contact there that would give me employment, and I had no real desire to make a fortune. Just enough to live on and maybe find a little place of my own. I was done with women for a long time to come, and I just wanted to be alone. Where I was going was just right for that. Annabeth Chase. I looked at the clock again, and it was only 7:30, just a minute later than the last time I looked. I was nervous, anxious to get this started, and a little afraid of what might happen. What if Ben couldn't forgive me? I didn't want to live without him, but he might not agree. I could only hope and pray that I hadn't ruined the life I had with him. That was my greatest fear, that he wouldn't take me back. Maybe I had messed up too badly. But no, not Ben. He would forgive me. He had to. What time was it? 7:35. I checked again to be sure the pizza was coming along and that the beer was cold. I had stocked the fridge just to be sure. I had set the pizza to come out just at 8 o'clock so we could sit down to hot pizza and cold beer, Ben's favorites. Perfect. He would be in a good mood, so he would listen. Yes, Ben Chase. I crossed the border at the check station at 7:21 p.m., just about perfect. I was now in Mexico, and it was less than 40 minutes to go. I could make it to the little bar that I had found on my last trip here, and that's where I would wait. It was just 7:50 when I parked my car, locked it tight, and went into the bar. It was cool and dark here, perfect for waiting. I took a seat at one of the tables, and a sweet young thing took my order. Since I spoke fluent Spanish, she smiled and swayed her hips as she walked back to get my beer. She was really cute, but she was a female, and I wanted nothing to do with them right now. I checked my watch, and it was now 7:55. 5 minutes to go. Annabeth Chase. It was 7:55, only a few more minutes. I wondered if Ben would be on time, or would he try to make me nervous by being late. I would wait and see. I didn't care, as long as he came. I waited, more nervous than I had ever been in my life. What was going to happen tonight? I didn't know, and I could only pray. As the clock struck 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. That was Ben. He was here. I checked my face in the hall mirror and went to the door. I paused to collect myself and opened the door. Annabeth Chase. The man standing there in my doorway was not Ben. He was a tall man, dark-haired with a face that was hard and cruel. He just looked at me as I stared back. I finally found my voice and asked him who he was. You're not Ben. Who are you, and where is my husband? So are you Annabeth Chase? Wife of Ben Chase? I just stared at him, not understanding what he was doing. I finally answered. Yes, I'm Beth. Who are you? I have something from your husband. He wanted me to give it to you in person. As he spoke, he reached into his jacket pocket. Ben Chase. It was exactly 8 o'clock. Peterson should right now be knocking on the door. I watched the second hand on my watch and waited for exactly 1 minute. There. It was over. I was now a free man, and I could do what I pleased. The feeling was not what I had hoped, but it was what I expected. Somewhat sad, but also exhilarating. It was done. I took a last swig from the bottle and left the bar, heading south. Annabeth Chase. He pulled out an envelope and held it out to me. With nothing else to do, I took it. Once I had the envelope in my hand, he began to speak, reading from a note he held in one hand. Annabeth Chase, you have been served. These are divorce papers signed by your husband Ben and filed with family court. Mr. Chase has notarized me to act on his behalf, and I have listed all of the assets you and Mr. Chase shared in common. You will find checks for half of the money assets in that envelope. All credit cards held jointly have been canceled. The house is in Mr. Chase's name and has been listed for sale. Once the sale is complete, you will receive half of the profits once the mortgage and all closing costs have been satisfied. The car you currently drive is in your name only, and you are responsible for any and all payments. I stood there listening to him, but not really registering any of the words. I was stunned. Ben had divorced me? Without even talking to me? I couldn't believe this. I didn't believe this. Where is my husband? Where is Ben? This isn't fair. It was only one time. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. Please, tell me where Ben is. I have to talk to him. Please. I slumped to the floor, there in the doorway, while the man turned and walked away. He turned once to tell me that I could contact him by the number on his card in the envelope. I finally stood and walked back into the house that was no longer my home with Ben. He was gone and I was alone. I had gotten my answer. Ben could not and would not forgive me. I understood. He saw his mother in me, and I had reinforced his opinion of her. We were all unfaithful, and he was leaving me just as his father had done. But Ben chose to live without me where his father had chosen to die rather than be with her. Like father, like son, but their choices were their own.